This is going to be a quick tutorial on some basics of working with 3D in After Effects. We're not going to be doing 3D animation. We're not going to be doing 3D modeling and building CG and stuff like that. It's just kind of introducing you to the 3D space in After Effects and how that works. And as a kind of demo for it, we'll use the basic title tool within After Effects and show you how that can work with the 3D space to do some interesting things if you're making titles or logos or things like that. And this will be helpful to you when you're working on your homework assignment making titles, and you'll see some tools and techniques you can do some cool things with in that. So let's start by making a new composition. So I'll make composition here, and I'm just going to go with my standard 1920 by 1080. I always like to work at 23976, not that it matters for this. And one thing that's important in here is I do want to check my 3D renderer and make sure that it's set to Cinema 4D. If it's not, there'll be an option later I'll point out where you can set it to this if you forgot to check this, but it's worth checking here just to save yourself time later. And composition name, I'll just call this 3D title demo. And I should always save my project itself. And I'll do the same thing, 3D titling demo. Okay. And what we're going to start with is just making some text. So say title, very exciting. And I have all my title tools over here. So if I wanted to, set a different font or something, say it like that, that's kind of cool. We got italics, whatever. You can mess with all that over here. You can also mess with it with individuals. So let's say I just want the E to be red. Could do something like that. And when I go down here, depending on what your view looks like, there's a couple ways I can do this. The easiest way for me is you've got this little 3D cube here, right there, and I'm just going to click the checkbox under it to make this title into a 3D layer, and you'll see this showed up. Alternately, you can right click on the title and select 3D layer to turn this into a 3D layer. And this hasn't actually done anything yet. We've just said, hey, I want to be able to work with this title in 3D. So, in fact, before we do anything else, let's just take this and kind of put it towards the middle of our screen. That looks good. When I go to my drop-down, you'll notice I've added a couple new options here. So whenever I do text, I always have the text option and the transform option. And once I do this, I add geometry and material. The other thing I'll note, if I go into, say, transform, if this isn't a 3D object, I'm really working in a XY2 coordinate system. I can move this left and right, and I can move it up and down. When I go into 3D, I have left and right, I have up and down, and I have forward and backwards, like towards us and away from us, which you can think of as moving, within the 3D space of the screen, coming out towards you or going out back into the depth of the screen. And I can rotate it in all those ways as well. So, I can rotate it around this axis. And you can see, by the way, it's still perfectly flat. So if I line this up exactly right, you would see nothing. I didn't get it quite right, you see. I can rotate it around the y-axis, spinning it like that. And I can rotate it around the z-axis, which is the axis that's coming out towards us. So again, you can imagine if there was a pole like going into the screen, it's kind of spinning around that pole. So those are all in the transform. Then I have these geometry and material options, and let's look in the geometry option. And I'll note that if you had not set your 3D render to Cinema 4D, this would be grayed out, and there'd be a little option here that says, do you want to change your renderer? And you can change it and set it to that and give After Effects a second to, you'll get a spinning wheel of death for a second, it'll stop, and then this will be available to you. So first thing I want to do is just give this a little bit of depth. And just so we can see what's happening, let me rotate this around the y-axis a little bit. Okay, so you can see we basically got this flat thing now. And when I go to extrusion depth, I'm just kind of thickening that out. So now you can see there is actually, and we'll get some ways to make this not all blur together like it is right now, but there's actually some depth to this. So even if I get this sort of like where we're looking edge on at it, there now is some thickness. It is an actual 3D object. It's not just a 2D object in a 3D world. That's what my extrusion depth is going to do. In material options, you have some things here that I would suggest you can play with when we get into lighting and such that can do some interesting things. I'm not going to mess with them right now. I'm just going to leave those as the defaults. I can also bevel this and can see a little bit of what's happening there around some of the edges. It's getting a little bit of a bevel and can deepen that out. Kind of see that. I think that'll show up better once we get some lighting on here. So I'll turn this back off for now and we'll get some lighting and then we can turn that back on again and you can kind of see what it does. So this immediately actually gives me a couple of things I can do. So now I can actually, move this through space. We can spin it around and stuff and, actually get a 3D effect. If it's rotating around like this, that's different than just a flat thing rotating around. We can actually see that 3D object rotating. But it still just looks like kind of this text that's been extended. And so for instance, when I started doing this, the T, I, T, L all just kind of blur together into one white blob here. So that's not really quite what we're looking for yet. So the other tool you want to be able to use if you're doing some 3D stuff is to play with your lighting and camera. And this should be stuff as filmmakers we're very familiar with. We know how important lighting is. And we also know it makes a big difference where you put the camera. So let's start with some lighting. I'm just going to go into the layer menu and create a new. Things that we've used so far are texts and solids, but let's actually make a new light. And there's different kinds of lights you can use. I'm just going to use a spotlight, call this spotlight 1. Okay, and I now have this light here, and you can see as I move it around, it is lighting that object. Right, so I immediately get a little more sense of depth and reality to this. If I start turning this, you can now see those letters individually depending on how they're catching the light. That's a tool, and once I've done that, that shows up here as a layer. And I have all sorts of options for the light. So what's the spread on it? How much does it make shadows? How quickly does it fall off? How narrow or dispersed is it? And what's the sort of sharpness of the edge? So you can see kind of, look over here, you can see whether it's kind of just actually going off there or very sharp. How wide of an angle is it hitting? You can make it very narrow, then maybe feather it a little bit more on something more specific. But just like everything else, I have these usual transform options. So, real easy thing to do. Would be I could take this and sort of make this come into the light. And maybe move it over a little bit, so kind of hitting the whole thing, and maybe let's make that spread a little wider so we can see the whole word. So kind of come in and reveal that. Kind of come in from one side to the other side. So I can start playing with all these things. I could also put in multiple lights. So I could put in a second light and put that in a different position, with a different intensity or a different color or however I want to do it to see different things. I could change the reflectiveness of my object. You remember down here I mentioned there's these material options and you can change all of these. I did say I would play with the bevel a little bit. Let's just take a quick look at what that looks like. And now if I move this a little bit, you can see a little bit there of what it's doing. Making a little bevel and the edges there. Okay, so I can do this and I can keyframe all of this. So, I could have my light, end here. And let's make that position there. And then, like I said, maybe it starts out of the way and comes in and gradually reveals this as we play. I can do that with light The one other thing I will mention here when we start working with 3D World is I can also use a camera. So if you imagine there's basically this giant 3D space inside here, I can choose where I would like the camera to be to show that. So I'm going to go Layer, New, and make a camera. And as film people, you will find this useful if you're into cinematography and stuff. I can actually choose my lens length. I can choose my film size, like what's the actual size of the sensor, focal length, all this sort of stuff. And I create that. And so far it didn't change anything, but like every object, I can go down here and you'll see there's all my camera settings. So I could change, am I zoomed in? Do I want to have a depth of field effect where, things fall off of focus further away? But I can also move my camera. So I could say, hey, the camera is going to start here. And then the camera is just going to kind of like that and change its rotation. Oops. Okay, so now I have something. Oops. Should have keyframed those. Let's go back over here and keyframe this to 0. There we go. Okay, so now what's happening is my object was staying where it is, my camera is moving to something else. I could do that by moving that object, but this way, let's say if I had, multiple things in this space, the camera can like move from one to the other instead of me having to move all the things individually. So let's say there was another, text object over here, text2. Okay, and let's make that a 3D object as well. And so put that right here. And now that's in the dark, so let's make a light on it. And I will say I find I don't do a ton of this, but I find the interface can be a little tricky. There we go. And you notice what I did there is when you start working in 3D space, it can get kind of confusing. So you can go to these different views and kind of see where things are. And the problem I was having was I couldn't tell where one of these lights was from that angle, so I needed to switch to a different one. But now what we've got here is something that kind of starts on one thing and then moves over in space to something else. Now, obviously, if these were just 2D objects, I could just slide one off and slide the other one on. But you start to get the sense of how you can really play with these and do interesting things with them once you're working this 3D space with the camera and lighting. I'll also say it's something that I think takes quite a bit of practice to actually get where you have a good sense of where things are and how you're moving them. But you can do some very cool effects with it. Something I didn't mention, maybe I'll kind of end with, would be, let's say we get to here and the camera kind of end. Let's have the camera just end here and not. Let's go to the next frame and delete it. Something else was still changing. Okay, so let's say the camera kind of ends here, and then we actually want to push in on it. We could. So we could say, okay, now what I want to do is push in and something like that, and Let's just sort of move over to this one. And really kind of bring it like right up close to the screen. Yeah, all sorts of stuff you can do with this if you want to. And we haven't even really gotten to playing with the different textures of the light. So I can make it cast shadows if there was a background somewhere. And you can put in a background, right? So I could make a solid object. And what I need to do then would be to find out where that object is, and I need to put it somewhere where things could, a shadow could hit it. So I do something like that, and then make sure that this text is casting shadows. Turn that on. And now it could cast a shadow back onto this white solid. I realized this was pretty messy. Like I said, this is not something I do a ton of, but I wanted you to know these tools are in here and it's some things you can play with and start making things more complicated in this 3D world. So key elements are you need to make sure you're making your objects into 3D objects, extrude them so they have some depth. And by the way, you'll notice my white solid here, I also get geometry options. So once this is a 3D object, I have some things I can do with that as well. So make your layers into 3D, extrude them, and then you can play with lighting and camera to control how we see them and what they look like and how you're highlighting the 3D aspects of them. So that's the idea of how 3D space works in After Effects.